And welcome back to the show. Our next guest is a restorative justice advocate who focuses on building community and empowering student voices. He encourages social, emotional growth for students experiencing trauma instead of the traditional school disciplinary methods. He believes education and restorative justice practices are tools where students can examine social justice issues and then become active students impacting their communities. Please be joined by the Restorative Justice Coordinator, Jorge Santos. And Jorge, good to have you.
Thank you, Daren. Thank you for having me.
Great. And when we talk about working with youth, obviously we know that there are some disciplinary measures that are handed down in terms of dealing with youth, but you got some pretty good alternatives under your belt. So a little with our audience about the work that you do.
Yeah, so a little bit about the work is when we think about a restorative justice model, it's really reflective on where do we want to see change, right? We can see the inequities in our schools, in our school culture. We know that we're operating in what we would call a white supremacy culture, right? And that the way education has been passed down, we have a descendant of the racist ways that school was, we forced us to assimilate. Right. So now we're trying to build a school culture that embraces our identities. Right. We want students to feel empowered. We want their voices to be heard. So what happens is that through restorative justice methods, we are really taking on the ideas and philosophies of how are we all interconnected. Right. How does my relationship with one another impact me and how does it impact others? So it really stems back to not just an alternative to suspensions and lowering suspension rates, but it becomes a way of being, right? A lifestyle. When we think about the Egyptian ancient, one of their philosophies was know thyself, right? So, and that's critical for us to allow our students to think about like knowing themselves, right? And not trying to remove their identity from them, but embrace it. So who are you as a whole holistic human being? How do you want to present yourself, right? And empowering them for their voices to be heard. And as educators, we really have an opportunity, and I think now more than ever, to really shift, right? And really create a school community that is focused on our child's well-being. And then through sort of justice, through conversations, through being able to hear them out, we do have like a space where our students feel like, you know what, I am valuable. I am a human being. I do have a voice and I can create change. And we're seeing that more and more as youth get involved in their communities to really have their voices heard.
Youth are raising their voices more now than ever before, but for a long time, there was somewhat difficult to actually get youth to really articulate and really to be transparent. Now, we do know that they have no problem once they're transparent or just throwing it out there and letting it out there. But for you, having these conversations and inviting them to these conversations, having that participation, share with us how hard, how difficult is it to really get the youth to really look at it from another perspective?
Oh yeah, it's super difficult. So what we have to do is really sit down and think about how do we build community in the first place? How do we go about creating a space where every student feels like they belong to that community, right? Most of the time, if a student feels like they don't want to be in school or, their school's a traumatic place, they're not going to open up, right? There's going to be barriers where no student's going to want to tell you about what's going on at home or where they're going to want to share personal stories with you. And it really starts with us as the educators and the staff members at a school, because if we can create a place where we're also vulnerable, where we're sharing our stories, then they eventually will open up and share their stories. But it has to be genuine on our part that we actually want to be able to open up about ourselves, but also hear their side as well. And I think that once you form those relationships, right? When you form that, that's where students start to come together and being like, you know what? I do want to voice this, or I have this issue. And they see you as someone that they can come to with a lot of the issues that they're going through. Because sometimes as adults, we sometimes forget they are going through things and we do want to be able to hear them out. No one's going to open up with you if you have a wall up, right? If I'm an educator and I don't talk about who I am outside of that school, what is my identity, then they're not going to open up about who they are, right? And you kind of create that wall. Now, if you break down that wall and you're kind of like, yeah, I like playing basketball and I used to play ball here. And, actually, I used to like hang around this neighborhood. Then they start to see you as a human being, right? And it's important that as they see us as human beings, we as educators, the adults in that room, also see them as human beings, right? As an equal. One of the issues that I have with the structures of school is, teachers standing up in front of the classroom, students sitting down and looking up at the teacher as if, the teacher is some sort of figure that's better than them, right? And we want to kind of like deconstruct that. We want to break that down. We want students to feel equal, right? Maybe I say something that they don't agree with and they want to challenge that. Classroom should be a space where they can challenge ideas, right? That's how they develop their point of views and how they can begin to articulate themselves. And I think that the more teachers start to investigate, how do I dismantle certain structures in a classroom that are creating inequities, then we're going to create a positive space of learning, and also a space where we can understand why students are struggling, because we know what's going on at home and we know what's going on in their lives, and we're going to develop, we're going to be able to understand their needs.
What about the conversations on racial equity? Obviously, in COVID, we became introduced to Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, and most of all, George Floyd. We watched that trial play out. Everybody in America and across the world really had some sentiment about the George Floyd death and then subsequently the Derek Chauvin trial. But that is nothing more than a microcosm of a macrocosm of the things that we're actually dealing with out here in America. And this conversation about racial equity, as young people, they're introduced to the race card and the race game at a pretty early age, particularly in the inner city. What's it like with those conversations, and what kind of conversations are you having around racial equity?
Yeah, there is a lot of work to be done, right? Anyone of color, especially the Black community, understands that what we witnessed during that time is something that has been going on for many, many years. So, there's people now that are like, oh, I want to get involved, and that's great, but they also need to understand that this is a space that we are living through and walking in constantly, right? We understood the police brutality, the way that it impacts our communities, the way that a Black man is in prison at a rate of 1 to 3, right, compared to a white counterpart. Latinos at a 1 to 6, and white males 1 to 18, right? There's a big disparity there. So what we're doing, some of the work that we're doing, is sitting down and analyzing looking at data and realizing that there are huge disparities. From an administration and teacher point of view, sitting down and looking at, well, we're noticing that if we are suspending students at a higher rate that are Latino, and Black and brown, well, why is that? Is it that there's something wrong with the structures that we're setting up? And then how do we dismantle that? Give you a small example would be like homework, right? And grading homework. So if we were to give grades out for homework, and that when a student goes home, that they may have to care for a parent, a sibling, that they may have to work a job to support their parent to make ends meet, well, then that's not fair that that kid is also being graded with another student that may have a tutor at home, right? Or has parents that can support them, that understand the language. So it's really putting on a lens of, well, where do we see inequities that are caused by race? And how do we go about creating equitable structures, right? Eliminating structures that we know are going to impact our students. That is one of the first steps that we can take from an administration and teacher role, is being able to investigate how oppression is showing up in that classroom. And there's a lot of work that has to be done around privilege, right? How does privilege show up for anyone? Where does oppression show up? And how do we go about understanding a student's intersectional identity, right? So we want to make sure that we're doing that work in the administration role. As students, is being able to open up this space and being very clear and open about the racist history of our country, right? Us being able to be like, hey, this is what's happened. How do we go about making it better, though, right? Because we have to come from a place of hope. And I think that that's one of the most important things that our communities, especially people of color, have always come from a place of hope and from a place of pushing our communities forward. When you think about the civil rights movement, and I think that right now we are living through a modern day civil rights movement, we're always constantly making our communities better. And I think that our students have to be empowered knowing that even though we may be going through dark days, that our people have always been freedom fighters, have always pushed for liberation. And that's the movement that we're seeing now. We want them to get involved. And they're going to need the information to understand how race does play a role in their communities and also in their lives as well. And I think that the more information they receive, the more they're able to understand how looking at our history can also improve our future. That's critical. That's critical work. And we want them to be able to do that.
We know that when it comes to history, it's history or his story. There's another story that's actually being told out there, another narrative. And for children and youth to be able to have a voice and to be able to be a part of that narrative is very powerful, especially now. We're seeing now more than ever, more young people actually rise up, become active in activism, really raising their voices, shouting out against injustice, the racial inequities that people are facing. Take me inside your organization. Talk to me about some of these conversations. What are you actually hearing on the part of young people that maybe we can articulate to a wider audience?
Yeah, well, we want our communities, our schools to be centers of healing, right? That's the most important part. We're all bringing in trauma into these places, right? Our students bring trauma into our schools. So it's really about sitting down and figuring out, how do we heal? How do we heal the harms of, such a history that has impacted, our generations for years? So it's, students are really open and receptive to critiquing the way things are, which is always positive. And I think that's something that the youth has always had over adults, being able to critique. And I think it also stems back to their curiosity, right, of what could be. And we don't want to limit that curiosity and that creativity. So allowing our students to sit down, really play around with, well, what would your ideal world be? What would your ideal community be? How do you create that community here in this classroom? And allowing them to do that, formulating interconnectedness with other individuals in that classroom, relationships, being able to solve conflict within that, using those skills in a classroom level. As they become adults, they're going to use those same skills. And that's where the restorative justice, conflict, de-escalating conflict skills come into play, building relationships come into play, because you want them to ideally move on and go into their communities and bring about this positive change. So if they're getting those skills at a young age, where they're able to critique, analyze, reflect, and grow, that's exactly what we want our students to be doing. And that's what we're seeing right now. That's why students are they're so passionate about making sure their voices are heard, especially when issues impact them, right? Because we all know when we were kids, we hated when our parents told us something. We're like, no, I don't, right? But we also were also told, hey, you can't talk about that, which I think we kind of have to start shifting that, right? We have to listen as to why our students feel a certain way when they're told something, and kind of reflect like, okay, is this something that may be causing some kind of trauma or oppression toward our student? Oh, you know what? It is. Let me hear them out. Why are they complaining? Why are they angry, right? Because they have every right to feel a certain way when it comes to bringing about change, especially, when they think about themselves and where they want to be. We need to be their advocates. We need to support them, and we need to give them the proper tools to be able to create impact.
Many times we see a child act out, we don't go to the deeper. We scratch the surface and just talk about their action. But from your take and your experience, share with us, you touched upon it just a few seconds ago. I know it's huge, the trauma. When you live in communities, urban communities, you're dealing with poverty, you're dealing with health challenges, you're dealing with a lot of these inequities. And consequently, there's a lot of racial trauma and societal trauma that young people are having to absorb that probably have not had to absorb in generations.
Yeah, we're talking about intergenerational social and economic trauma, right? That educators are going to be dealing with our students. So what we get at the face level, right, when we see a student acting out, well, did that student eat breakfast, right?
Right.
Did that student have a rough day at home? Did the parent, by any chance, maybe miss their rent, right? This is something that we're navigating and dealing with constantly in our school systems. So when a student acts up, it's not about just being like, you know what, I want to remove them from the classroom, or I want to remove them from the school community. It's, can we get people to sit down with them, talk to them about what's going on, and then also be able to hear their story out, right? I think that's one of the most powerful tools that we as educators can give students, to be able to hear their story. And it's not like they're going to open up right away, right? Because we know that there are going to be barriers and walls. They're not going to feel trust. They're not going to trust a system that they feel has oppressed them for many years. So it's little by little being able to sit down, have conversations, being able to just be like, hey, let's take a walk. I had a student that wanted to play football. He kept telling me about it. And I was like, you know what, this kid would be great for that. I called the program up and I was like, can this kid get added? Like, he'd be perfect for that. Like, he needs that sense of family, right? It's being able to hear our students and hear some of their needs, and then going above and beyond. I think, as a teacher, it doesn't start or stop in that classroom, right? It goes beyond that. I still have students that have graduated that contact me and hit me up, telling me about how their life is and asking for advice, and I'm more than glad to give that to them. I do think that we are people that nurture our students and help them grow. And I think that when we sit down with students that are having the most trouble, those are the ones that actually need the most attention and love and support, right? Because we want to get through to see what is causing that trauma, right? Where can we support them? When can the healing begin? And little by little, and it takes. And one thing I will say about restorative justice is it's not a quick fix, right? It's not an alternative to suspensions and being like, boom, don't worry about it. You're good. We'll just remove them from the classroom. That's it. It takes time. It takes effort. It takes many conversations. And I think that's why people sometimes like, I don't want to invest in it. It takes too much. But this is what our students need. And if we really are true about our craft and the work that we're doing, we're going to invest the time and energy to make sure that we're putting our children in a better position as they leave us and move on to their other schools or to their other careers.
Yeah. Before we go, if a parent is out there watching or you got a young person out there watching, how can they get connected to you and what can they do?
Yeah, my website is jorgesantos.site, SITE. Feel free to reach out to me. And then I'm big on Instagram at Restoring Racial Justice. So you can find me there as well, too. That's at Restoring Racial Justice. And I'm always posting content that hopefully gives people information and inspiration. I think that we have to be able to inspire the next generation and also gain inspiration from the youth as well.
Yeah. Well, Jorge, I want to thank you so much for being with us here on the show. Certainly a great conversation. Got to bring you back so we can continue to talk about these topics. They don't go away, and we need your voice. Thanks so much, brother.
Thank you, Daren. I appreciate you having me.
All right, Jorge Santos, our guest here, talking about restorative justice. Got more show. Don't go anywhere. We'll continue with more on the social justice forums in a few.